Hi, I'm Ozzie Ostwalt, and welcome to Religion and Life. Most of us have heard of Joel Osteen and, of course, Billy Graham. This week, we're going to meet the woman who invented evangelism and broadcasting, Aimee Semple McPherson. My guest today is Dr. Jim Goff, chair of App State's Department of History. Welcome, Jim. Thanks for being on the show.
It's good to be here.
Aimee Semple McPherson might be the most important 20th century evangelist that no one's ever heard of. So I'd like to start just by asking you to tell us who she is, how she got her start in evangelism.
Yeah, I've been pleased that she has made her way into textbooks in recent years, as you have a picture and a short mention of her. But you're exactly right. I mean, she represents so much about the 20th century, coming of women's rights, the continued importance of evangelism, but the adaptation to new media. She's born, ironically, right at the heyday of the Dwight L. Moody. She's born in 1890 in Ontario, Canada, on a dairy farm. Everything about her early life, in some ways, is part of the story. Her father was a pretty straight-laced United Methodist choir leader, church organist, musician. Her mother was Salvation Army through and through. And Aimee
and Salvation Army has connections to the holiness tradition.
To the holiness tradition,
right.
Not the Pentecostal tradition, but the holiness tradition which preceded it.
Right.
And it has, as we know today, just a tremendous work ethic in the community in terms of social justice, not necessarily the social gospel from a theological standpoint, because they tend to be fairly conservative evangelicals.
Right.
But from a practical standpoint, they feed people, they raise money, they help people. And all of that is absorbed by Aimee as a young girl. She's extremely bright, very, very precocious, preaches, learns early on, preaches to her dolls, you know.
So when she was a little girl, she was preaching?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a common story among a lot of great preachers. They actually do that.
They line up their pets and their dolls.
Yeah.
Okay.
She was fascinated with theater, just in general. And as a young girl, she did some theater in local school plays and stuff, and then felt convicted about it, because this was a period when people who were associated with the holiness movement, at any rate, frowned on that sort of entertainment. And in many ways, I guess, the country, or at least the religious country, all the better for it, because she then turned all of those attentions and talents to religion. That's not unlike the great George Whitefield, the British 18th century evangelist, who had dabbled in drama and then was convicted about it, but became a wonderful preacher. And Aimee's story is changed specifically, though, when she's 17 years old. She meets a young Pentecostal preacher by the name of Robert Semple, who comes to her hometown in Canada. And Aimee is influenced, converted to Pentecostalism, experiences the baptism of the Holy Spirit with speaking in tongues. She also falls in love with Robert Semple. And they move in Pentecostal circles for a few years. They go to China not long after they're married as missionaries. They're preparing for this extended period in China, learning the language. And Robert Semple dies tragically of effects of malaria just weeks after they get there. He gets sick and then dies.
Now, has she been preaching at this point yet?
No.
Or just, no.
No.
Okay. All right.
Now, she had felt convicted about evolution. She had dabbled with evolution as a young girl going to school, and so her religious commitment had sort of formed at that point, and maybe even, you know, ossified, I suppose, at least in terms of becoming a conservative, which she is, but not as a preacher. I mean, that she's going to be a preacher's wife and a missionary, a helper.
So how in the world does she make this transition?
Well, Robert dies, and she's left there literally. She's 8 months pregnant, and he's gone, the love of her life. She never got over that. She adores him throughout her life. And she stays there till the baby is born, and then she and Roberta, she names her daughter after her husband, Roberta Semple, comes back to the United States, and she lives in New York for a time with her mother. Her parents they stay married, but they're a little bit estranged during this period. And she begins to preach at that point. She also meets somebody else, and a year later she's married to Harold McPherson. And it's the McPherson period that allows her to get back into the ministry, which she had started with Robert, but she very quickly overshadows Harold McPherson. He becomes the person behind the scenes making it happen.
She becomes the A-liner.
Spends most of the teens traveling across the country with a tent in a car she dubbed the gospel car. She was a master at advertising, big placards on the side of the car.
Right,
she would
right.
go into a town broadcasting her news and begins to draw impressive crowds. By the end of the teens, she and McPherson are estranged. They ultimately get divorced, which goes against her theological tradition. And in the 20s, she remakes herself into a pastor and sort of city evangelist. She ends up in Los Angeles, starts a radio station in 1922, KSFG.
And this is really new stuff, right?
Yeah,
this is
because
radical
radio,
and revolutionary, right?
the first stations are in the early 20s. This
Right.
is and she's very effective. I mean, she speaks on the radio. There's a neat story of her not long after her radio station. There's an earthquake, and Amy hears about it, immediately goes on the air, and she gets people to the scene of the action with food and blankets and medication long before the Red Cross gets
It's
there.
the old Salvation Army history. in her.
And when she forms Angelus Temple, she builds it and opens it in January 1923. It had a bread line every day. Through the Depression of the 1930s, never misses a beat. She feeds people, she houses people. She combines the social gospel without having social gospel theology. She combines it with evangelical conservative theology, and she does it as a woman and becomes everybody's sister. That's
so Sister
the title
Amy.
of it. Yeah, Sister Amy.
Well, you know, this is really, I mean, she really had foresight here to be able to adapt to the changing culture, to the radio, to her personal struggles. But this thing of radio evangelism, I want to stress the importance of that, because she's really maybe the first person to recognize the potential with that type of media.
Yeah, KSFG will be on the air for the rest of her life and will be a major part of her interaction with the community. So she becomes larger than just the church. Now she will in the 1930s go back out on the road some, but she never goes back to the tent. In the 20s, right, when she forms Angelus Temple, and we're talking huge, I mean, it was 5,300 seats. And when Amy would do a major production, she called them illustrated sermons, which was sort of a merging of Broadway and evangelical preaching. She would fill it 3 times, back to back. The crowd would be lined up, first crowd comes out, 5,300 people more. So that's 15,000 people on a given Sunday that come, including, by the way, the great Charlie Chaplin, who used to sneak in to watch Amy.
Sneak in.
Yeah, he would sneak in the back, you know, and watch her. She was an amazing talent, an amazing personality.
So the elements of entertainment, I'm hearing you say.
Clearly, right.
So in some ways, she not only may have been a pioneer in broadcast evangelism, but in some ways, this megachurch movement and the emerging church movement we see today, where evangelists are packing large stadia, right, using entertainment to bring in people. Sister Amy was doing this in the 20s.
In the 20s, yeah. And she forms her own denomination, the Foursquare Gospel, in part because she had been Assemblies of God. Robert Semple was Assemblies of God, and she remained Assemblies of God through the teens when she's touring and on the road, in good standing. But when she builds Angelus Temple, she doesn't want to sign the building over to the denomination. And they're uncomfortable with her having it in her name. They apparently would have been okay with putting it in maybe a set of trustees. But Amy wanted it in her name. So we're talking about a woman who wants to be in charge.
Yeah, that's an entrepreneur.
And knew what she was doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, we have a video clip here, and it's fairly rare. You know, our listeners will not have heard the compelling voice of Sister Amy. So
right.
let's take
That's
a
good.
moment here and watch this video and listen to Sister Amy.
Leaving Los Angeles for New York and the boat upon which we sail immediately, I was met en route by multitudes of our friends. Among them ever was a liberal sprinkling of newspaper men. And in each city, they asked the same question: Sister McPherson, what do you think of prohibition? It was rather difficult to answer the question in such a few words as one must use them. But I told them that the case of our prohibition here in the United States reminds me of the story of the lecturer who gave a marvelous address on prohibition. And he wound up in a blaze of glory that brought everyone to their feet enthusiastically. Why, he said, my friends, if I had my way, do you know what I'd do? I'd take every barrel of liquor, every bottle of booze, every crate, and I'd empty it in the river. Yes, sir. Then he said, shall we now close our meeting by rising and singing together, Shall We Gather at the River?
That's something, isn't it? What are your initial impressions of her there?
Well, several things come to mind. The two most visible Protestant religious leaders in the 1920s, Billy Sunday, who was a converted baseball player, and Aimee Semple McPherson. And Billy came off as harsh, authoritarian. Aimee can say the same thing, same message, but do it in a sort of loving, open way, being a woman, becoming the mother figure, the sister figure, and she doesn't get labeled with the criticism that Sunday did.
Well, she really had, in this video clip, a sort of glamorous air about her. She had the mink stole, and we've got a couple of images here that you can talk while we look at them, but one is of Aimee in clerical robes, if we can see that, and then the second image is of Aimee in a different type of attire that gives us a different view of her. Really a glamour shot in an evening gown.
Well, there are a lot of evolutions. You know, one of the things, any kind of business you get into, and religion is no different, if you're going to be successful, you have to adapt. You see that in Billy Graham, you see it in Oral Roberts, you see it in Dwight L. Moody in the 19th century, and you certainly see it in Aimee Semple McPherson. In the teens, when she's traveling around, she looks a lot older. She looks very motherly. She's also heavier. Her hair is not cut. And in the 20s, she keeps that image pretty much until there's a scandal in 1926 where she disappears. They think she's dead, and then she comes back about a month later, and she has this story about having been kidnapped. A lot of people questioned that at the time. They think maybe she had a liaison with a lover. There were charges that were about to be brought, not enough evidence, and it polarized people. People either believed Aimee or they didn't, but it also changed Aimee. After the scandal, 1926, when the press, which had been very complimentary, suddenly turns against her, Aimee remakes herself into the image you saw there as a very successful woman of the time. She cuts her hair, she begins to dress more elegantly and fashionably, and the Aimee in the 1930s is visually quite different from the Aimee of the early 1920s. And glamorous. People who saw Aimee and wrote on her, newspaper reporters and others, talked about the fact that she had there was a sex appeal which came across. A lot of them talked about how beautiful she was. But others talked about how close she seemed, the fact that she seemed like somebody you knew, that you could depend on. Now, we haven't talked about the fact that early in her ministry, she focused on healing some. The press always focused on healing more than Aimee did, and that's probably true of all Pentecostals.
Because healing grabs headlines.
Healing grabs headlines, and it was a fundamental part of the Holiness Pentecostal tradition. Aimee would have a 2-week campaign in a city in the 1910s. She would have one night dedicated to healing.
So it may not have been the most important thing from her perspective.
Aimee never considered it the most important thing, but the press focused on it. And Aimee benefited from it because it brought people to see her. And she continued to sort of play with that, and I think be about as honest as you can be about it. Aimee never claimed to have the power to heal, but she did acknowledge that God sometimes used her and the faith of the individual for them to be healed.
Does that approach that she took to healing differ from later healers that we may see on TV or even today? Is there something that differentiates her?
I think it's different from a lot of them. I think the more credible people, he gets criticized, Oral Roberts does, but Oral was really pretty good about people would come to him, he'd pray for them to be healed, and he would say, go see the doctor. if this is a real healing, the doctor will confirm it. Now, the news media doesn't focus on that, and the critics don't focus on that, but oral did that. But a lot of people weren't as honest and above board as oral. And they essentially gave the impression that they had this power, and it brought people in. And some were caught faking healings and exaggerating healings. And so it can be a double-edged sword. It can bring in the publicity, but it can also backfire. And I think Amy understood that and was quite aware of the need to keep some control over what people thought about it.
Right. So if I hear you correctly, the more credible healers in this tradition tend to downplay the actual their role in it.
They certainly downplayed their role in it. They saw it as a power from above. They didn't quite understand. They were somewhat awed that God was using them to help people have the faith to be healed. They were always saying, I don't know why some people are healed and some aren't. I mean, they kept the mystery alive. And if you don't do that, then eventually the message becomes about you, not about God, and you're probably in trouble.
Right. Now you mentioned Amy's beauty, her appeal, a quality about her that made people feel like she was dealing with them and them alone and drew them into her. These are characteristics we sometimes call charisma, perhaps. Do you think, your gut feeling watching Amy on that clip, do you think she would have made the transition to television evangelism had she come later in the 20th century, for example?
Absolutely, I do. I mean, that period from the clip you saw, that was early. And Amy wasn't very comfortable with it, had not been exposed to it very much. She dies in 1944, toward the end of World War II, and she's a strong supporter of World War II, sells bonds, raises money for, supports the troops, those sorts of things. She dies in 1944. She's only 54 years old. If she'd lived another 10, 15 years, I have no doubt that she would have transitioned into early television and would have become quite good at it, would have adapted. I mean, somebody like Charlie Chaplin, was a natural at it, and he was attracted to her in part because he saw this talent and the recognition of how to transfer that into new media, and she certainly did that.
Now, we don't see many media evangelists who are women. It's a field that seems to be dominated by men in the contemporary setting. But here Amy had this freedom early on to be successful in these areas. There's something about the holiness tradition, I think, that gives women a voice and authority in a way that some other conservative traditions don't. Could you touch on that, perhaps?
Pentecostals in particular, to some degree holiness tradition, Salvation Army holiness tradition, some others as well that had given women greater voice. But Pentecostals in particular, early in their history, allowed women a voice. It was also interracial. So on both those fronts, women and interracial worship, they sort of led the way. Now they will retreat in some ways later on as they become more acceptable, more middle class. You'll see fewer women and you'll see more segregation by the 30s, for instance. But Amy grew up in that tradition. The fact that she left the Assemblies of God to some degree, I think, shows though that denomination was sort of moving away, maybe, or beginning to move away, and Amy didn't want to be controlled, so she formed her own denomination.
And that's the Foursquare.
The Foursquare Gospel. And until recently, it was just not so very many years ago, there'd only been 2 presidents of the organization, Amy and then her son, Rolf McPherson. She had a daughter by Robert Semple, as I said earlier, and then a son by Harold McPherson.
And just as an aside, you said you had met the daughter.
I met Roberta Semple. She was a special guest up in Toronto at a Society for Pentecostal Studies meeting. And she was about 90 years old, and they had her come in. She and her mother were estranged fairly early on. She felt controlled, dominated. I mean, it's an interesting thing because Amy had the same kind of relationship with her mother, Minnie Kennedy, who ran the business part of her operation for many years, but then they separate in the late 20s, and her mother goes a separate way. So Amy had a tough relationship with her daughter, tough relationship with her mother, but a very strong relationship with her son, who succeeds her and is actually traveling with her when she dies in 1944.
So tell me about the Foursquare Gospel Church today. Is it an international organization?
Yes.
Thriving?
Yes, it's stronger on the West Coast than on the East Coast. But in fact, there used to be a church here in Boone that was, a lot of ASU students went to it. This was back in the 80s and 90s when I first came here. That was quite a big church. I think there were some problems in church, and it's no longer here now. But that was an exception to the rule. It's always been stronger in the western part of the United States. Like most Pentecostal denominations, very strong overseas. There has always been a strong missions emphasis among Pentecostals, in part because Pentecostals see themselves as a sign of the end time. And so they see themselves as God's way of preparing the world for the coming end. So it's their job to go out and share the message.
And just to clarify for our viewers, Pentecostal tradition and groups practice various gifts considered charismatic gifts of the Holy Spirit.
Right.
Chief among them, speaking in tongues.
Chief, that's probably the one people notice the most. But it's actually one of many signs.
And healing is part of that.
Healing is an important part. In fact, that's what the Foursquare Gospel was. Foursquare, the box.
Right.
Salvation, sanctification, which came out of the holiness tradition, a lot of it Methodist oriented, healing, and the premillennial second coming of Jesus Christ. Those are the four sort of hallmarks of Pentecostalism, and that's where Amy got the name.
Sister Amy's a remarkable person. I mean, if you think back, this story that you're weaving here is a charismatic personality, troubled personal life, successful businesswoman and an entrepreneur, talented, surrounded by scandal. I mean, and yet she's successful throughout all this, adapting to the changes in her life, to the changes in the culture, to the media surrounding her.
Amy's struggles become something that I think her audience identifies with. That they have struggles, Amy has struggles. Now, I didn't even mention the fact, Amy gets married a third time in the early 30s to a man much younger than her. It was one of the most controversial things she had done. And her second marriage was not a problem. Her first husband had died. Within the Pentecostal tradition, early 20th century, if your mate dies, you can get married again. But there were a lot of people who thought you shouldn't get remarried if your original spouse is still living. There might be a reason for a divorce if you're being abused or some such, but not remarriage while the person lives. That was the traditional spin that most Pentecostals had. And of course, Amy broke that in the early 1930s when she marries David Hutton. And the marriage is also not a good marriage. It only lasts a couple of years.
Did she deal with this publicly? I mean, the kind of indiscretion part of it? Or
by that point in time, because of the scandal in 1926, Amy has, I mean, the support for Amy has very much polarized. You're either for Amy and you believe Amy, or you believe she's a charlatan and you don't quite trust her. But the marriage hurt her among traditional Pentecostals, the third marriage, because people said, well, you know, Harold's still living, and you guys said you had some problems, you couldn't get along, but that's not necessarily a reason. And then the fact that it didn't work, she got divorced a second time.
Right.
Amy was in many ways, I think, an unhappy person, I think. But like a lot of great people, entertainers in here, you think of Elvis Presley, for instance, who was always much more comfortable on stage than living his life. And I think you say that about Amy in some ways. Billy Sunday had a troubled personal life with his kids. Probably wasn't a very good father. Franklin Graham has been very open about the fact that his father was gone a lot. And it was Ruth that really created the stability of the Graham home. So it's not an uncommon story for evangelists of this sort. And Amy, to some degree, faced all of that.
So a lot of the most prominent evangelists into the 19th century, through the 20th century, given themselves over totally to their mission,
to their work.
Have
Even John Wesley, for heaven's sakes.
True, that's right.
I mean, so, you know, it's not that they necessarily have a scandal, but they're just not necessarily home and focusing on the family
right.
in the way that they might have if they didn't have this this commitment.
Yeah. With all the things Amy accomplished, Jim, what do you think her most enduring legacy is? What did she do more than anything else to change the face of American evangelism?
I think the single most important thing is that as a woman, she succeeds as a major religious player. I mean, the irony is that Amy was not a feminist. If you listen to her theology is conservative. Her position about gender roles is obviously conservative, except for her.
Right.
And therein lies an important thing, though, that Amy led by doing and by being someone.
Right.
And the fact that in the 30s she cuts her hair and she begins to dress more glamorously, I think shows to a lot of women that maybe some of the old strictures of society weren't necessarily embedded in stone.
Right.
I think that's the single most important thing she does. She's just a woman who achieves. Beyond that, her use of radio, the building of the mega church at Angelus Temple, which is still there, and
Right.
I visited about 2 years ago, and it has a wonderful urban ministry. It's still a flourishing church. I got to walk up on the stage and stand there where Amy did her illustrated sermons. Yeah, it was pretty interesting.
It's really a remarkable story.
It is.
Fascinating woman, pioneer. I think changed the face of evangelism in the 20th century in many ways. And I appreciate you coming today to share the story with us and talk about Sister Amy with us. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Ozzie. Appreciate it.
Well, that's Religion and Life for this week. If you have questions, comments, or suggestions, please contact us at watchapptv.com. Until next time, I'm Ozzie Ostwalt.